Hi everyone, I'm Molly. I'm Head of Evaluation and Partnerships for Targeted Projects at the Youth Endowment Fund. The Youth Endowment Fund and the Home Office are co-funding a new funding round which launches for applications on the 1st of September this year. And we're looking to find promising programmes of trauma-informed practice, specifically training and service redesign activity, which we will fund and evaluate to look at how well these activities, these programs are working. I'll be presenting some information and guidance today that I hope will be helpful for prospective grantees in particular when preparing their funding applications. Right, so in this presentation I'll give a very brief introduction to the Youth Endowment Fund. I'll explain our understanding of trauma and trauma-informed practice, so the definitions that we'll be using for the purposes of this work. I will explain why we're interested in trauma-informed practice and what we're looking to fund, so what kind of sort of programs or activities in particular we're interested in, and I'll give a couple of examples. I will briefly touch on our approach to evaluation. We'll talk you through the application process, what that involves, and I'll give some answers to some common questions and some information about next steps as well. So what sort of things you should be doing to prepare if you do want to submit a funding application. So who are we at YEF? YEF is a charity that was set up in 2019 with a £200 million endowment from the Home Office to work towards our mission, which is to prevent children and young people from becoming involved in violence. This slide sets out our strategy. We look to achieve our mission by finding out what works to reduce youth violence in England and Wales and building a movement to put that knowledge into practice. So we look to fund the most promising projects from among all of the good work that's going on, and we know that there's a lot out there. And we find these promising projects, programs, initiatives through three different funding streams. So we've got our themed grant rounds, priority themes, as it says here on the left, which many of you will probably be familiar with already. We've got our place-based work, and we've got our targeted projects funding. So this opportunity that I'll be talking about today sits within targeted projects. And then once we've identified these promising projects, we fund their evaluation to determine if and how they're working, and also for whom. And then we try to disseminate the findings from these evaluations far and wide. We want to ensure that we want everybody to know what works to prevent youth violence, so we can all be working in the most kind of efficient and effective ways towards achieving our common goal. So we look to help the best ideas scale up and roll out more widely, and we spread good practice in that way. Partnership working is also key to what we do, so we don't believe that we can achieve any significant change all by ourselves, and it's important that we're working with others who are also keen to protect our young people who are most at risk. So when thinking about young people who are most at risk of becoming involved in violence, we must, I think, recognise the importance of early childhood experiences of trauma. So I think it's very fair to say that the definitions of trauma and what constitutes a traumatic experience do vary quite a bit. We think of it, we think it can be broadly defined as an event or series of events or set of circumstances experienced by an individual or community which is or which are physically or emotionally harmful and or life-threatening, and which can have lasting adverse effects. So in the literature we often see traumatic childhood experiences as being referred to as ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. These can include emotional and sexual abuse, domestic violence, divorce or discrimination, and even more than that, trauma can include experiences of poverty, experiences of racism, witnessing community violence, and much more than that. And there's a growing recognition that childhood experiences of trauma really influence children and young people's development and their behaviour, and this sort of thing needs to be considered, we believe, when working in sectors with a high prevalence of trauma among children and young people. And that's to hopefully enable staff and practitioners to be able to respond appropriately, and ideally to be able to avoid or prevent re-traumatisation of those young people as well. Okay, so our understanding is that to be trauma informed means that an organisation or a system or a practitioner works with young people in such a way that realises the impact of trauma, recognises the signs and symptoms of trauma, and seeks to resist or prevent re-traumatisation. And being trauma informed and integrating knowledge of trauma into ways of working with young people, including explicitly through planning and policies and practices. The idea is that staff, organisations, workforces, etc. will be able to improve the quality and the relevance of the care or support that's being offered to those young people. So in this round, we're interested in funding and evaluating practice that occurs at the level of the practitioner or organisation. So for this funding, we're not funding or evaluating trauma-specific interventions that work directly with young people. I'll come back to that. Okay, so moving on to the funding round itself. Why are we doing this work? So we know that there's a lot of trauma-informed practice going on out there, but we also know that the pace of evaluating the effectiveness of this kind of activity has not kept up with the speed of rollout and adoption or implementation of trauma-informed practice. And in particular, there hasn't been much robust evaluation conducted which looks at the offending behaviours of the children and young people that the trained professionals, practitioners, organisations exist to support. So many of you will be aware of our YEF toolkit, which is where we synthesise and give an overview of the evidence that does exist at the moment around interventions and programmes that aim to reduce or prevent youth violence. It's a great resource, and I'd suggest that you'll check it out if you haven't already. But I mention it now only to point out that trauma-informed training and service redesign is an intervention that exists on the toolkit with kind of question marks all over it at the moment. So we don't have the evidence or the quality of evidence that we need to allow us to confidently say that this type of activity makes a difference to the outcomes that we're interested in. And with this funding round, we want to change that. So through this work, we're aiming to identify the most promising and valuable models of trauma-informed practice across youth justice, education and children's social care sectors mainly, although not exclusively. We're not totally restricting ourselves to those sectors, and that's work being done in England and Wales. And in doing so, hopefully, our aim is that we will start to build the evidence base in this area. So the overarching research question that we have in our minds is, how effective are trauma-informed training and service redesign programmes in preventing young people from becoming involved in violence? So we'll launch an open call for proposals on the 1st of September, as I've mentioned. That will stay open until the end of October. It's a date for your diaries. So please do jot that down. And we hope to find and fund in that time between 2 to 3 approaches or programmes. So we'll spend £4 million in total on the delivery of these 2 to 3 programmes, and we'll put up an additional £1 million for the evaluation of those programmes as well. Again, that's in total, so that's across all of them. We will be matching each funded programme with an independent evaluator who we will appoint, and they work together with the delivery provider, practitioner partner, to ensure that the programme can be set up for a robust evaluation. And preferably that will be an experimental evaluation. So we're interested in trauma-informed training and service redesign programmes. As I've mentioned, we're not in this case interested, or we're always interested, but in this case it's out of scope for us to look at trauma-specific interventions. So things like trauma-focused CBT, for example, be eligible for funding through other YEF activity, but just not in this particular funding round. So we are looking for providers that work across these areas, these sorts of areas of activity. So organisational learning. With this, we're imagining staff training programs, including things like training on techniques to reduce vicarious trauma, increasing understanding of trauma, training staff on how to adapt their ways of working to take account of trauma, etc. Organisational policies, so providers that work with organisations to help them adjust their policies and ways of working to make them more trauma informed. And that might mean ensuring senior leadership buy-in through rewriting organisational strategies, ensuring reflective practice is built into their staff's activities and so on. And organisational processes, so kind of making sure that trauma-informed processes are embedded into, trauma-informed approaches, are embedded into organisational processes. So that includes things like incorporating young people's trauma histories into their case plans and so on. Ideally, we would want applications from providers that work with organisations to do as many of these things as possible, since we believe that the more intensive models are likely to give us a better shot at identifying impacts on the sorts of outcomes that we're interested in looking at through our evaluations. We want to fund models that ultimately aim to benefit children and young people who are most in need of trauma-informed practice. And that means that the models should be focusing on benefiting children and young people that have been exposed to trauma and or one or more adverse childhood experiences and or show behaviours that are associated with exposure to ACEs and are associated with an increased risk of becoming involved in violence. So we've considered the previous and recent research in this area and the kind of the recommendations that have come out of those studies, and we're particularly interested on the basis of those, particularly interested in approaches that include trauma-informed training that's delivered as a part of broader efforts to implement trauma-informed practice, including organisational policies and processes, as I've mentioned. So, for example, developing new organisational strategies to become trauma-informed, or maybe smaller scale efforts like putting in place additional support for staff wellbeing. Particularly interested in approaches that deliver training to senior staff as well as frontline practitioners, those that focus on the connection between changes in knowledge and changes in practice. Because from our point of view, training practitioners to increase their awareness of trauma is one thing. We'd also like to see that translated into changes in practice. So also approaches that include ongoing activities and support to reinforce learning and the implementation of transforming or translating this knowledge into practice. Approaches that involve communities in co-creating trauma-informed practice and take account of local delivery context. So, for example, getting young people's feedback on training content and taking account of delivery context, for example, through engaging with professionals in the specific sectors that are targeted through the training to, to facilitate a tailored and kind of appropriate approach. Interested in approaches that have developed quality assurance processes, and this is an important one, quality assurance processes to ensure that training is of a consistent and high quality, and approaches that assign trauma-informed trainers and champions within the workforce, so including, for example, training staff to specialise in trauma-informed practice, champions that have resources and time allocated to support embedding that into the organisation. So, in case helpful, here's an example of the type of activity a provider might be doing that would be eligible for our funding. So, an example could be a provider has a skilled team of professionals, including educational psychologists, for example, who have lots of experience in attachment theory and neurodiversity, and maybe consultants as well who are helping organisations develop their strategies and their workforce development. So this provider might be interested in using YEF funding to expand their activity and to learn more about how their approach is working, if and how their approach is working. They're partnering with possibly a youth offending institution, which is keen to upskill their staff at all levels of the organisation, so including senior leadership and management, officers, admin staff and other support staff. And the provider might have developed a suite of training materials that can be delivered to these staff. So these teaching materials might cover how to recognise the signs and symptoms of trauma, how to respond appropriately, how to manage and limit the impacts of vicarious trauma, and maybe practical strategies about how to implement it in a secure setting. So, for example, steps to follow once staff have noticed that young people are showing signs of having experienced trauma, or maybe the officers sort of come together to hold fortnightly reflective practice sessions with other officers to share and learn from experiences when trying to support young people who have experienced trauma. These training materials might be delivered via a series of lectures and interactive workshops with groups of up to X number of staff at a time, delivered as a 5-day course spread over the course of 1 month. And in addition, maybe the programme involves training or sort of holding workshops to train senior staff to gain their buy-in, and to train them in supporting their own workforce to work in a more trauma-informed way, including thinking about how to tailor their policies and processes to bake trauma-informed practice into their everyday work. The programme might also involve identifying, helping the youth offending institution to identify a number of trauma champions who are responsible for the ongoing implementation of trauma-informed practice across the institution, and they would be responsible for maintaining a high standard of practice, and who return for refresher training courses once every few months over the year. So that's an example of a programme that does many of the things that we've listed here that we're particularly interested in. Okay, so a quick run through of our eligibility criteria. We are looking to fund providers that work with staff and organisations who ultimately exist to benefit young people that have experienced trauma or are at risk of becoming involved in violence. These target young people should ideally be between the ages of 10 to 18 or 10 to 21 in the case of looked after children or children with special educational needs and disabilities. We want providers that deliver the types of activities I mentioned before: training, changes to policies, processes, and so on. And these providers need to be registered organisations that are operating in England and/or Wales and that are sufficiently large to meet the requirements of a randomised control trial or a similar evaluation design. So as a rough guide, we've said that this means working with practitioners who will ultimately reach at least 500 children and young people within the 18-month funding period. Although that figure is subject to change, it will be determined during the co-design process, which I can explain a bit more in a bit. And also to say, we've also got an eligibility checker for organisations on our website, which sets out the criteria a bit more clearly, and you can go through that just to check your eligibility. And also to note, this isn't part of the eligibility criteria, but it's something that we really want to stress. We're particularly interested in receiving applications from organisations that are led by Black, Asian and minority ethnic leaders, and/or whose work has a particular focus on ultimately benefiting young people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. So ultimately, our interest is in looking at whether the programmes of trauma-informed training or service redesign that I mentioned earlier will lead to reductions in offending among young people. So we'll be seeking to track that through our evaluations. And as mentioned, these evaluations would ideally be randomised control trials or quasi-experimental designs that compare the outcomes of staff or professionals, practitioners, and the children and young people that they come into contact with that took part in the project with the outcomes of staff, children and young people that did not take part and continued with their usual practice, so continued with business as usual. Through our evaluations, we'll also aim to find out how the models were implemented and how and why they worked or didn't work. The evaluation, as I've mentioned, will be designed and conducted by an independent evaluator, which will be appointed by us, and they will work in collaboration with the successful applicant. So as part of your application, we want to understand the outcomes that you believe that your approach will have. So as said, we're ultimately interested in violent and non-violent offending outcomes, but because we want to prevent children and young people from becoming involved in violence in the first place, we also want to look at how impactful trauma-informed approaches can be in affecting other outcomes that are related to offending behaviour later on, which are sometimes termed risk factors or protective factors. So our evaluations will therefore also look at the wider set of long-term outcomes shown here, so behavioural difficulties, drug and alcohol misuse, involvement with criminal peers, and so on and so forth. We recognise also that in order to have an impact on young people in the long term, trauma-informed practice must first have shorter-term impacts on the staff and practitioners who receive the training or the service provision. So we might assume, for example, that a training programme leads to increased knowledge of trauma among staff, which results in improvements to their practice, and this subsequently means the young people working with this staff experience better outcomes. So we need to measure each stage in this causal chain. This means that we're also interested in evaluating a project's impact in the short and the medium term outcomes that we've listed here. Okay, so I've talked you through what it is that we're looking to fund, and now I want to come back again to YEF and explain how we approach evaluations. This is a really important part of the presentation. It's key to how we work, and it's crucial that all of our grantees are fully on board with our approach. So YEF is a what works centre, meaning that evaluation is absolutely integral to everything that we do, every funding decision that we make. So we would never fund the delivery of a programme without also funding its evaluation. And I'm using this slide just to bring this out very clearly. So we see programme delivery and evaluation as equally important. And for YEF, we are specifically looking to fund the most rigorous approaches to evidence generation. I've said this already. By that I mean evaluations that involve randomised controlled trial or similar. So each project we fund, we identify and fund. We'll be working with their evaluators who will select from a panel of our brilliant evaluation experts, and the evaluators will guide grantees through a very detailed process of designing an evaluation that is well suited to the programme. And the programme might also need to be tweaked to accommodate the evaluation design. So this is all part of what we call co-design, where grantees and evaluators work together. So that's later in the process. It's not something that grantees need to know a lot about for the purposes of the application, but cooperating with the evaluators is a condition of all of our grants. And it's really a great opportunity for grantees. So grantees don't need to have, grantees don't need to have any evaluation knowledge or technical skill. That they will be working with evaluators who do have those skills. So why is evaluation so important? Well, it's key for us because we believe that in order to allow all of us to provide the best care for children and young people, we need to be as sure as we can about what works for whom and how. We need to be able to tell whether programmes achieve their intended impacts. We also know from existing research, that some programmes that were initially thought to be beneficial are in fact harmful. And boot camps is an example of that, and you can find out a bit more on our toolkit. So we can't just take things for granted and assume we know what's best for young people. It's only fair that we make sure that we know that what we're doing is actually helping. So it's important to us that the way that we spend our endowment is also helpful for grantees and to the wider sector. We want to help grantees improve what they're doing, so to understand if what they're what they're doing is achieving their intended aims, and if so, to help them be able to showcase that. And then when we do find out what works, we want to play a role in helping the best organisations and initiatives to grow and scale up and to spread best practice, as I've mentioned. The data from all of our evaluations is stored in our data archive so that we can look at the long-term impacts of the programmes that we fund, and hopefully to lead to lasting and sustainable change. So you can find out more about the archive on our website, which again is a really important part of what we do, and that's also a condition of our funding. Okay, so types of evaluation. I won't go into too much detail on this, but it is important for grantees to understand the types of evaluation that YEF will want to seek to fund. Many of you may know about randomised control trials already and what they involve. If so, feel free to skip ahead, and if you don't, I'll explain very briefly here what it is. So we'll always try to fund commission a randomised control trial of the programmes that we're interested in. In its simplest form, what this means is that participants that are eligible to take part in a programme are randomly assigned to either a treatment group, which receives the intervention, the support, the programme, or a control group that receives either an alternative intervention or continues business as usual. So important to note that this won't mean that children are left, or practitioners or anybody is left without support. It's just that they will continue with business as usual. So in this case, we would probably look to randomise the organisation or the practitioner that is receiving the training or the service redesign provision, possibly also randomising young people that they come into contact with, if that's possible with the design. It's something that we would need to work out with evaluators during co-design. Randomisation means that each participant has an equal chance of being selected to receive the intervention, and this randomisation ensures that each group of participants in the trial are as similar as possible to each other, so that the treatment group is as similar as possible to the control group, aside from the fact that they took part in the intervention, and therefore any differences in outcomes can be attributed to the intervention received and not some unmeasured influence that might be biasing the effects. So this is the gold standard in evaluation and evidence generation, which is why we strive to do it. It's the best way to establish cause and effect. However, in a few cases there is a good reason why an RCT just isn't possible. Perhaps randomisation is just absolutely infeasible in some cases, or it could be that we found a really promising programme but it hasn't been delivered for very long yet, and so we're not entirely sure about how feasible it is to implement. In the first case, if randomisation is definitely not possible, we could consider using a quasi-experimental design, which basically tries to establish a kind of cause and effect relationship through means other than randomisation. So it sort of mimics the other characteristics of experimental designs as far as possible. In the case of an intervention that is slightly less well developed, a programme that's less well developed, we might consider running a smaller scale pilot study first, although we would only do this in a very special case. And for this funding round, we've decided that we're limiting we're limited to a maximum of 1, if any, pilot evaluations. Okay, so I won't get any more technical than that for today. And just to reiterate, grantees do not themselves need to know about evaluation. They just need to be on board with it, and they need to agree to be guided by our evaluators and to be aware of and in agreement with all of YEF's policies on evaluation. Okay, so back to what we're after for this funding round and what we would like to see in your proposals. The first point is probably the most important one, so that is the clarity of your proposal is really, really crucial. So after reading your application, we need to have a really clear, unambiguous and sufficiently detailed understanding of what your programme is and how it's implemented in order to be able to score your application. due to the high volume of applications that we are expecting to receive, we will probably have to mark down or even possibly disqualify applications that don't provide us with enough information about the activities that their programme comprises. So please, when you're writing the application, do remember that even though you know your work inside out, and this is probably something that you do every day, we really know nothing about it. Our assessors probably, we're coming at this completely blind, so please don't assume any prior knowledge. For example, I think proposals that say we deliver trauma training to teachers, probably not going to be giving us enough information to mark on, to score, sorry. So instead, it would be important to describe all of the details. So what's the purpose of the intervention or the programme? Who are you? Who are your team? What skills does your team have? What do you do in your programme exactly, and in what order? When do you do it, and with who? And for how long, and where? So in what region? In what setting? Is it a school? Is it a community setting? Is it a youth centre? And under what conditions, in what context, and so on and so forth. So those details are really, really important. We need a good level of detail. Can't stress how crucial that is for the success of your application. We also will want to understand how you think your programme will support children and young people and what outcomes you expect to see. I've spoken a bit about that already. We know that there is not a lot of robust evaluation in this area, but we will be interested in seeing any preliminary qualitative or quantitative data on your approach that shows it has promise. Ideally, you will have already been delivering the programme for at least 6 months, or you may be applying a practice that has been applied elsewhere for some time, or in a new context or new setting, and that's absolutely fine. If found to be effective, we'll need to understand how your approach could be scaled up. So it needs to be potentially replicable, scalable and cost effective. So we need to understand all of that. And as I've said before, a willingness of YEF funding is, of course, also to be independently evaluated. Okay, so we will have 7 big things in mind, at least 7, and this is subject to change, but gives a good guide. So 7 things in mind when we're reading through your proposals, and I think it would be helpful for grantees to know what these are. So the first is that we'll be asking, does this programme intend to reduce youth violence? The second is, if so, what is the likelihood of this programme reducing youth violence? And so with this question, we're essentially trying to figure out whether your programme is likely to work. And there are 2 parts to this. So A, we want to know what the programme involves, and if you can demonstrate that these particular activities are likely to lead to a change in the outcome. This is sometimes called a theory of change, which is a method to help you describe your long-term goals and maps backwards to explain how your project will get you there. It will help you to clearly articulate your planned activities and to understand how these can lead to short and medium and hopefully long-term impacts. So I can come back to that. And second, or B, we're interested in understanding what the existing evidence says about how successful your chosen activities are likely to be. Third, we'll want to assess whether your programme is really focused on ultimately benefiting the young people that are of specific interest in this round. And that's, of course, those that have experienced trauma or are at risk of becoming involved in violence. Fourth, we'll want to be able to assess the likelihood of your programme leading to large-scale changes in the future if it's proven to be effective. So a core part of YF strategy is scaling up, as I've mentioned. When a programme is proven to be effective, we'll look to expand it. So that could include sort of expanding existing provision or replicating projects in new locations across their networks. Okay, fifth, we'll want to assess whether you're likely to be able to deliver your proposal to a high standard. And to do this, we'll look at your previous experience, the support, training, supervision you provide delivery staff, the expertise of your staff, and your understanding of the various risks associated with the programme and how to mitigate them. We'll also assess if you have experience of reaching professionals and organisations in the sectors or areas that you're suggesting that you deliver in. So in short, we need you to be able to demonstrate a really strong capability to deliver your programme. Sixth, we'll be trying to tell whether we can properly evaluate what we do. So whether it will really provide us with a good opportunity to understand what works. In order to do this, we'll need you to ensure that you're reaching enough organisations and professionals and then ultimately young people for us to run an RCT or a QED. As mentioned, the ballpark estimate figure, which will be confirmed later on, that you'd need to be working to is working with enough practitioners to ultimately reach at least 500 young people over the 18-month delivery period. So the scale at which you're delivering or have the potential to deliver over the delivery period in question. We'll also prioritise organisations that have well-defined delivery models and have a proven track record of delivery. Although, as I've mentioned, we won't discount those that don't. We will consider doing pilot trials first in the case of one successful application. And we'll be thinking about whether it's going to be possible to identify which organisations and practitioners have been engaged with your programme, then which individual young people they've been in contact with. Since for the evaluations, we'll have to be able to track the outcomes of individual young people over time. So that's key. That's all in the evaluability question. And then last, we'll be looking at whether you'll be able to deliver to enough organisations and providers for us to run a randomised control trial. So that's the point I made before about the sort of scale of delivery or potential scale of delivery with if you're successful in securing funding. Okay, so there's just one thing in that criteria that I want to come back to because it's really important that this is understood very well. We want to make sure that the applications we receive are based on a strong programme theory. So what do we mean by that? So the application asks, what is the theory behind your programme and what evidence is there to support this? So with this question, what we want to understand is whether there is any underpinning theory to explain if and how this is fed into the design of your programme. So what is the theoretical basis for what you have planned is an important question that we would want you to be able to answer. We will need you to be able to tell us what are the core components of your model. And also what are the key causal mechanisms that link these core components, so these specific particular activities that happen as a part of your programme that link these core components to the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve. So core components are the parts, the features, the attributes or characteristics of a programme that that influence its success when it's implemented effectively. And in terms of theory, so of relevance here might be the literature around the links between childhood experiences of trauma and negative outcomes later in life. We want to know whether you have a good understanding from previous theory and literature about what kinds of interventions can work to break that link. So have you thought about child development, attachment theory and neuroscience and how these can shape practical approaches to supporting children and young people to recover from trauma? Just as a couple of examples. And does this theory underpin your model? So we want to know how the different activities or components intended to change knowledge and skills and attitudes and processes, policies, behaviours, etc. of either practitioners or organisations in the short or the medium term. And then in turn, we'd want to know what change you hope to see on the individual level outcomes. We do totally understand that not everybody will have had the chance to develop a really strong theory of change, and for some this might be the first time that you've heard of it. But if you do have a clearly defined model, it should still be possible for you to set out the hypothesized chain of causality. So I'll give you an example. So say that your program involves 2 weeks of intensive trauma training of social workers and senior staff across yachts, across youth offending teams, along with a refresher course, say 3 months later. And ultimately you want to reduce the number of rearrests among young people that are brought into the yacht having been arrested for the first time. So the question is, how exactly do you imagine your program is going to link the staff training activity to the improved outcomes for young people? So the hypothesized causal chain, it might go something like this. So your training hopefully leads to increased knowledge about trauma among yacht staff. So that's a short-term outcome. You might then imagine that this increased knowledge allows them to recognize the symptoms of trauma in the young people that they're working with. So maybe they're more empathetic when they're witnessing externalizing behaviors, and they're better equipped to understand how to respond to young people's trauma and how to support them with it. The yacht management staff, having also been trained to understand the stresses that working with young people with complex trauma histories can cause for their staff, they've put in place strategies to support them in mitigating the impact of possible vicarious trauma, you know, ensuring that they're able to continue working with young people in the most effective way. So the increased knowledge and understanding has, in this hypothesized case, led to a shift in the way staff work, so specific improvements to their practice, and that's a medium-term outcome. Your hypothesis might then be that the young people that are supported by the trained social workers within that yacht experience fewer incidents of re-traumatization because they're protected against that, which can lead to your ultimate goal of reducing externalizing behaviors and preventing their likelihood of committing another offense. And just one more of the particular assessment criteria to pick up on is existing evidence and how you can draw on this in support of your application. So essentially what we want to know here is whether there is any existing evidence out there from relevant research and or evaluations that have been conducted that suggest that your program or your approach is likely to work. So what is this evidence? Can you share it with us during the application? In your application? If it wasn't done on your program, but it was done on a similar program, that's okay. That's still helpful for us to know. It would also be helpful for us to know how similar that program was. Was it in a different context, in a different country, with different young people, or was it looking at different outcomes, possibly? So maybe let us know where the similarities and differences are if you're drawing on evidence of that kind, so that we can think about whether this serves to suggest that you might be, you know, onto something really great. Also, if you've done any monitoring of your program and you've looked at data from that and have made improvements or adjustments to your delivery as a result, that will also show us that you've carefully developed your program over time, and will tell us how you've done so. I've mentioned this briefly already, but I do want to reiterate it here. So at YEF, we are fully committed to recognising the very unfortunate issues of disproportionality in the youth justice system, and we want to be proactive in our efforts to combat that. We're also committed to ensuring that our funding reaches organisations that, in some cases, often due to their small size, struggle to get the funding that they need. So to reiterate, we are particularly interested in receiving proposals from organisations that are led by Black, Asian and minority ethnic leaders, and or whose work has a particular focus on ultimately benefiting young people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. If you are from a Black, Asian and minority or minority ethnic led organisation and don't think that you fully meet our eligibility criteria, we are still interested in hearing from you. And at this point, it's important to stress that we are also welcoming applications from consortia. So if you're operating at a relatively small scale but have a model that is comparable in important respects to other models that are delivered by other organisations, it could be that it's possible to come together to form a consortium and submit a joint application. Either way, if you need a bit of guidance or would like to talk that through, we can consider your possibilities if you get in touch with me, molly.bourne@youthendowmentfund.org.uk. So very much welcome those conversations. So applications open on the 1st of September, as I've mentioned, and you'll be able to find the form for the application on our website, which is under current funding opportunities. So yeah, if you go to funding at the top, current opportunities, and you scroll down, trauma-informed practice should be in there. So we strongly recommend completing your application offline first and then copying and pasting it into the online form only when you're ready, just to avoid losing any work. You can save your applications as you go along, but it's just a safer way to do it, to make sure that you've got an offline version as well. And you can see all of the questions as well as the guidance for answering them in our full and detailed application guidance, which will be available on our website from the 17th of this month, and it will also be available in Welsh. So we recommend using this application guidance, so really do read it in full. It's a long document, so it will take a minute, but it should really help you to complete your application and make sure that your answers fully cover everything that our assessment team need to know in order to assess your submission. So we're hoping that organisations seeking to apply are planning their applications already, reaching out to us for more information, detailed conversations, arranging consortiums if that's necessary, and so on. It might also be that providers and delivery organisations are working together. So if a provider has identified, say, youth offending institutions or youth offending teams or other delivery setting that they would like to be working with, it could be that those it's a joint proposal, or at least in the application you've mentioned that you do have an idea of where you would be delivering your work. Similarly, if delivery organisations are interested in having providers come and work with them, it's also helpful for us to know, so that we can possibly help to facilitate those links. Okay, so the application window I've mentioned opens on the 1st of September and remains open for 2 months. We'll be doing assessments and ultimately deciding who to fund by the end of January next year. And then we appoint an evaluator and go through the process of co-designing the evaluation with all partners. It's a detailed process that I mentioned before. This will take about 5 to 6 months and will happen over the spring months and into the summer. And then we'll grant final approval at the end of July, and delivery will need to start in August and will need to be wrapped up by March 2025. Okay, so some answers to some common questions. Can we apply multiple times? Yes, you can apply multiple times if you have multiple programs or projects. If several of your projects got to the shortlisting stage, we might approach you to understand a bit more about their interdependencies and to talk to you about your capacity to deliver more than one project at a time. On the point of applications coming through from consortia, if you are part of a consortium, just please ensure that there is one organisation that takes the lead and submits the application on behalf of the consortia. Second question, how much funding can we apply for? So we have a £4 million pot to spend on a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 3 projects. We do not need them to be of equal size, so it will totally depend on the nature of your programme. You understand your programme best, so we just ask you to please be realistic with your budget and your applications, and we can work with you on more detailed aspects of your budget if you are awarded funding. Question 3, do I need to be a charity to apply for the funding? No, you do not need to be a charity, you just need to be a registered organisation delivering in England and or Wales. Question 4, how many organisations or practitioners do we need to work with? We don't at this point have guidelines on how many organisations or practitioners you need to be working with, but as I've said, we just need to make sure that the number that you are working with will in turn be working with more, at least 500 young people over the delivery period. So, for example, if your approach involves delivering training to social workers who each have a caseload of 15 young people, you'd need to be delivering to, I think, around 30 to 35 social workers. Hopefully that maths is right. Do I need to identify the organisations or practitioners before I apply? So, as I've said, if you are able to do some of that work before submitting your application, and you can list the partners, delivery partners, etc., that you are keen to work with, and you can demonstrate that they're already keen to be involved, that's always helpful. You don't have to, though, so we can work with you on your recruitment strategy if you are successful. So for now, you just need to evidence that you have the capacity and the skill and the experience to reach appropriate settings at an appropriate scale. And we would also want you to think about how and why those organisations or practitioners you would want to work with are kind of appropriate, and your likelihood of being able to engage them. Question 6, would expansion of already existing delivery be within scope for this funding? Yes, scaling up and extending existing delivery is absolutely appropriate, but we would want you to deliver to new settings with our funding. So this is important for randomised controlled trials or quasi-experimental designs. It's important for the evaluation. The reason for this is that the approaches that we would like to take for the evaluation involve a kind of pre-post design, as well as a treatment and control group. We have a pre-post design. Those outcome measurements need to be taken before any delivery has started. So if you're already working in a setting, an organisation, etc., it wouldn't be possible for us to collect baseline measures because you're already delivering that activity. So yes, it does need to be delivered in new settings and/or with new practitioners, and/or reaching new young people that won't have already worked with those trained practitioners. How do I know what type of evaluation is best for my approach? So as a part of the application, you do not need to specify the type of evaluation we would do. You just need to be ready to and willing to work with evaluators to design the evaluation design if you are successfully shortlisted. So instead, you should focus on describing the approach to delivery in a lot of detail, as well as the theory linking your approach to the intermediate and trial level outcomes, so that we can read it and have a really good understanding of what you're doing, and therefore hopefully be able to determine whether your approach is valuable or not. The last question, if we are successful in this funding round, would we be eligible for other funding? So it's unlikely we would fund the same approach again until the evaluation has happened. But you could still apply for sort of other parts of your work. Okay, so thank you for listening, and well done if you've got all the way to the end of this presentation. Much of what I've said will be set out in our detailed application guidance. There'll be a lot more in there too, so please do keep an eye out for that. That will be on our website from the 17th of August. In the meanwhile, if you have any questions, if you're interested in this funding, please do reach out to me. I included my email in earlier slides, but you can also find that on our website as well. Very much look forward to hearing from you, and I'm really excited about the applications that we'll get coming through for this round. Thanks very much.